Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Darren, and this is how my wife's affair, disguised as a social media challenge, cost her career, our marriage, and any respect I had left for her. Back in 2018, when Vanessa and I got married, I never thought she would end up cheating on me. We were both in our late 20s, establishing our careers, and genuinely excited about building a life together. I was working as a software project manager, and she was climbing the ladder in marketing at a mid-sized tech company. We seemed to have everything going for us, good jobs, a nice apartment, and what felt like unlimited potential for our future. The first few years of our marriage were everything I'd hoped they would be. We did weekly date nights, took spontaneous weekend trips, and couldn't keep our hands off each other. Vanessa was affectionate, funny, and genuinely interested in spending time together. She'd wait up for me when I had to work late, and I'd surprise her with flowers just because it was Tuesday. By year 4, things started to naturally slow down. We weren't as obsessed with each other as we'd been during the honeymoon phase, but that seemed normal and healthy. We were both getting promoted at work, taking on more responsibilities, and our relationship had settled into what felt like a mature, stable partnership. We still loved each other, but the constant romance had evolved into something more comfortable and sustainable. I expected this transition and didn't worry about it. Every married couple I knew had gone through something similar. The initial passion mellows into deeper companionship, and you build a life together based on shared goals rather than constant excitement. Vanessa seemed content with this evolution, too, and we were both focused on advancing our careers while we were still young and childless. Vanessa would gradually begin working significantly longer hours. She'd always been dedicated to her job, but she started staying at the office until 8 or 9 p.m. several nights a week. She'd come home exhausted, eat a quick dinner while scrolling through her phone, and go to bed early. Weekend work emergencies became more common, and she'd spend Saturday mornings dealing with urgent client issues that couldn't wait until Monday. I attributed these changes to her growing responsibilities at work. Vanessa had been promoted to marketing director earlier that year, and she was managing a larger team and bigger projects. It made sense that she'd be busier and more stressed. When she'd collapse on the couch after a long day, I'd rub her shoulders and listen to her vent about difficult clients and tight deadlines. The physical intimacy in our marriage started declining around this time, too. Vanessa was always tired, always stressed about the next day's meetings, always dealing with some work crisis that required her immediate attention. Our romantic life went from spontaneous and frequent to scheduled and infrequent. When I tried to initiate intimacy, she'd often say she was too exhausted or had to finish some project on her laptop. Again, I told myself this was normal. We were both in our early 30s, working demanding jobs and dealing with adult responsibilities. The constant passion of our early 20s had naturally evolved into something more mature. I figured once Vanessa got settled into her new role and felt more confident in her responsibilities, our personal life would improve again, and we would prepare to raise a family together. What I couldn't have imagined was that all these changes weren't completely about work stress at all. They were early signs that Vanessa was already beginning to check out of our marriage emotionally, even though I wouldn't discover the full truth for another couple of years. The real wake-up call came around our 6th anniversary. I wanted to do something special to reconnect with Vanessa and show her how much our marriage meant to me despite the recent distance between us. I planned a surprise romantic dinner at home, bought a bottle of expensive wine we'd enjoyed periodically, cooked her favorite pasta dish from scratch, set up candles throughout our dining room, and even bought fresh flowers for the table. Vanessa typically closes from work around 6:30 p.m., but since things have begun to slow down, she will get home around 8:30 p.m. I planned dinner for 8 p.m., expecting her to know it's our anniversary and come home earlier. I texted her around 6 p.m., saying I had a surprise waiting for her at home and to try to leave work on time. She responded with heart emojis and said she was excited to see what I'd planned. 7 o'clock came and went with no Vanessa. I texted asking if she was on her way, and she responded that she was running late because of a big presentation tomorrow and would be home as soon as possible. By 8:30 p.m., The food was getting cold, and the candles were burning low. I tried calling, but she didn't answer. At 9:30, she texted saying the meeting was running longer than expected and apologizing for the delay. Vanessa finally walked through our door at 10 p.m., looking genuinely exhausted and carrying her laptop bag. She saw the romantic setup and apologized profusely, saying the client meeting had been a disaster and she'd had to stay late to fix the problems. But instead of sitting down to eat the dinner I'd prepared, she said she was too tired and stressed to enjoy it properly. She grabbed a yogurt from the refrigerator, told me we could do this properly on the weekend, and went straight to the shower and bed. I sat alone at that carefully prepared table, surrounded by melted candles and the smell of food that had been sitting out for hours, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of our marriage. This wasn't just about work stress or natural relationship evolution. Vanessa had chosen to prioritize a work meeting over our anniversary, and when she did come home, she couldn't even pretend to appreciate the effort I'd made. That night, I was angry enough to start a fight about her priorities and our relationship, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I knew if I said anything while I was that upset, it would probably be things I couldn't take back. Instead, I decided to wait a few days until I could approach the conversation more calmly and constructively. 3 days later, I asked Vanessa if we could talk about our relationship. I explained how I'd been feeling disconnected from her lately, how our physical intimacy had declined significantly, and how I felt like we were living more like roommates than married partners. I told her about my disappointment with the anniversary evening and how it felt like work always came before our marriage. Vanessa's response was frustrating and dismissive. She said there was nothing wrong with our marriage and that I was overthinking normal relationship changes. She said her work held her back from being home early for the anniversary dinner, and we can always have one. According to her, all couples went through phases where they were less romantic, and work stress was temporary. She accused me of being unrealistic about adult relationships and expecting us to act like newlyweds forever. When I tried to explain that this wasn't about wanting constant romance, but about feeling like we weren't prioritizing each other anymore, she changed the subject to her upcoming promotion opportunities and how important this period was for her career. The conversation ended with me feeling unheard and Vanessa acting like I was creating problems where none existed. This dismissive attitude was actually more hurtful than if she'd gotten angry or defensive. If she'd argued with me, at least it would have shown she cared enough about our relationship to fight for it. Instead, she acted like my concerns were invalid and unworthy of serious discussion. Over the following months, things got progressively worse rather than better. Vanessa was working late 4 or 5 nights per week consistently because of the promotion opportunity she was chasing. She'd started taking work calls at home during dinner, and weekend emergencies became the norm rather than the exception. She'd get texts at all hours that she'd immediately respond to, even during the few intimate moments we did have. Our physical relationship deteriorated to maybe once every 3 or 4 weeks, and even then, it felt perfunctory rather than passionate. Vanessa would approach intimacy like another item on her to-do list, something to check off so she could get back to work or sleep. The spontaneous affection we'd once shared had all disappeared completely. I tried to cope with this loneliness by burying myself in my own work. I started staying late at the office, taking on extra projects, and volunteering for assignments that required travel. If Vanessa was going to prioritize her career over our marriage, I figured I might as well do the same. But working more hours didn't give me the peace or satisfaction I was looking for. It just made me feel like we were two people who happened to share an apartment rather than partners building a life together. Some months later, I finally decided to confide in my friend about what was happening in my marriage. This friend and I had been friends for many years, and he'd always been a good listener and straight shooter when it came to relationship advice. I explained how disconnected Vanessa and I had become, how she seemed more interested in work than in spending time with me, and how I felt like I was losing my wife gradually. He listened to everything I had to say, then asked some pointed questions about Vanessa's behavior changes. He wanted to know if the long work hours had started suddenly or gradually, whether I knew the details about her work projects, and if I'd noticed any other changes in her routine or personality. When I described and answered these questions, my friend's expression grew more serious. He told me about his own experience with a girlfriend who'd had similar behavior changes, and how he'd later discovered she was cheating. According to him, situations like mine often had things going on underground that the partner wasn't aware of. He suggested that I consider hiring a private investigator to find out what was really happening with Vanessa's work schedule and social life. The idea of hiring a private investigator felt extreme and like a betrayal of Vanessa's trust. I'd never been the kind of person who snooped on their partner or assumed the worst about their behavior. But my friend pointed out that my trust might be misplaced, and that getting concrete information was better than continuing to wonder and worry about what was happening. I spent a month thinking about this advice before finally deciding to move forward with hiring an investigator. The decision came after a particularly difficult week when Vanessa claimed to have a client dinner that ran until 11 p.m. on Thursday, then had an emergency weekend planning session on Friday that lasted until 9 p.m. When I asked for details about these work events, she gave vague answers about client names and project deadlines that didn't seem to add up. I contacted a private investigator who specialized in domestic cases. He was professional and straightforward about what he could and couldn't do, what the investigation would cost, and how long it might take to get results. He explained that most cases like mine were resolved within 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the subject's routine and how careful they were about their activities. The 6 weeks of waiting for the investigator's results were among the most stressful of my life. I tried to act normal around Vanessa while constantly questioning every late night, every work excuse, and every change in her behavior. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored: how often she checked her phone, whether she seemed excited about work events, how she dressed for different types of meetings. During this period, Vanessa actually seemed happier. If I hadn't been suspicious already, I might have thought she was just enjoying her job and feeling confident about her career. In mid-December, the investigator called me with his findings. He'd been following Vanessa for 6 weeks and had documented extensive evidence of an affair with the sales director at her company. He had photos of Vanessa and the director together at restaurants, entering hotels, and meeting at locations that had nothing to do with work. He'd also somehow obtained credit card records showing that many of Vanessa's business meals were actually personal dinners with the director that she was charging to the company. The timeline the investigator established showed that the affair had started around a year ago, which explained why Vanessa had been so dismissive during our anniversary dinner. She'd already been involved with her co-worker for months by then and had probably been comparing our marriage to her exciting new relationship. The long work hours, the weekend emergencies, the constant texting, all of it had been a cover for meetings with her co-worker. The investigator also discovered that the director was recently divorced and had been through a messy separation from his wife about a year earlier. He and Vanessa had apparently bonded over his divorce experience and her growing dissatisfaction with our marriage. They'd been meeting for months, and their relationship had clearly become serious and ongoing rather than a casual affair. I sat with this evidence for 3 days before deciding how to confront Vanessa. Part of me couldn't believe that the woman I'd trusted completely for 6 years had been lying to my face for months. I felt stupid for believing her work excuses and for attributing our relationship problems to natural marriage evolution rather than her deliberate emotional withdrawal. I decided to confront her face-to-face at home. On the 3rd day after receiving the private investigator's report, I called Vanessa to have a conversation that night after she was done with showering. When she came, I asked directly, "Why would you want to cheat on me?" There was complete silence for several seconds. Then Vanessa started saying she didn't know what I was talking about and would never cheat on me. But my tone must have conveyed that I had evidence, because her voice changed completely as she realized this wasn't a random accusation. She started deflecting and making excuses about the pressure she was under at work and how I didn't understand how stressful her job had become. When I mentioned that I had proof of her affair, she immediately started acting like I was just making things up. I brought out the private investigator's photos and documentation and waited for Vanessa's reaction. When she saw the evidence, her face completely crumpled. She couldn't deny what was right in front of her, and she broke down crying. But instead of apologizing or taking responsibility for the affair, Vanessa came up with an excuse that was so ridiculous I almost laughed. She claimed that her relationship with her coworker was part of a marriage challenge she'd seen on TikTok. According to her explanation, the challenge involved testing whether your spouse would fight for your marriage if you seemed to be pulling away. She said she'd started spending time with her coworker to see if I would notice and make more effort to win her back. The affair was supposedly a way to evaluate our relationship and determine whether we were truly compatible for the long term. The coworker had been helping her assess our marriage by providing a comparison to what she could have with someone else. At that moment, I realized that Vanessa would say absolutely anything to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. A TikTok marriage challenge was such an absurd excuse that it actually made me angrier than if she'd just admitted to having an affair because she was unhappy. The idea that she'd deliberately damage our marriage as some kind of test was more insulting than simple infidelity. I told Vanessa that I was filing for divorce immediately. This announcement caused her to break down completely, crying, begging for another chance, and promising that she'd end things with her lover and focus on our marriage. She said the challenge had shown her how much she really loved me and that she was ready to prioritize our relationship over everything else. But I knew that trust was permanently broken regardless of her excuses or promises. If Vanessa was capable of lying to my face for about a year while conducting an affair, what else was she capable of that I didn't know about? Even if the TikTok marriage challenge explanation was somehow true, the fact that she'd deliberately hurt our marriage to test me showed a fundamental lack of respect and maturity. I contacted a divorce attorney the next day to begin divorce proceedings. It took several weeks to get all the paperwork prepared, and during that time, I had to continue living with Vanessa, while we both knew our marriage was ending. She alternated between begging for reconciliation and acting angry that I wouldn't give her another chance. Even when the divorce papers were ready, I felt bad about serving them to Vanessa. Despite everything she'd done, we'd been together for years, and I genuinely loved her. Ending our marriage felt like admitting failure, even though I knew the failure was hers rather than mine. But every time I thought about forgiving her, I remembered those periods of lies and deception, and I knew I could never trust her again. When I handed Vanessa the divorce papers, she broke down again and pleaded with me to reconsider. She promised she'd do anything to save our marriage and said her coworker meant nothing to her compared to what we'd built together. But her promises felt empty after about a year of lies, and I was focused on moving forward with my life rather than trying to punish her for her choices. The divorce process took several months to complete, but Vanessa and I were able to divide our assets relatively amicably since we didn't have children or complicated financial arrangements. Neither of us fought for spousal support, and we split our savings, sold our apartment, and went our separate ways without a lot of legal drama. However, the consequences for Vanessa extended far beyond our divorce. The legal proceedings made her affair with her coworker public knowledge, and office gossip spreads quickly in corporate environments. Most people at their company knew about their relationship, and HR began investigating whether company policies had been violated. Vanessa was panicking about her professional reputation and job security. Their company had strict policies forbidding romantic relationships between directors, and she knew that her affair with her coworker could cost both of them their jobs. She tried to minimize the relationship and claim it had been brief and casual, but too many people had seen them together for those explanations to be credible. Months later, the company launched a formal investigation into Vanessa and the other creative director's relationship. The investigation discovered that they'd been using company resources for personal meetings, charging personal dinners as business meals, using conference rooms for private conversations, and claiming travel expenses for trips that included personal time together. Months later, the company launched a formal investigation into Vanessa and the other creative director's relationship. The investigation discovered that they'd been using company resources for personal meetings, charging personal dinners as business meals, using conference rooms for private conversations, and claiming travel expenses for trips that included personal time together. Following their discovery, Both Vanessa and her lover were terminated for violating company policy and misusing company funds. Their termination records would make it extremely difficult for either of them to get similar positions at other companies in their industry. Word travels fast in corporate circles, and being fired for an affair that involved financial misconduct is the kind of reputation that follows you. Vanessa was forced to transition from corporate marketing to freelance work, which meant giving up her steady salary, health insurance, and the career trajectory she'd worked years to build. Instead of the promotion she'd been expecting, she was starting over with a damaged reputation in her industry. Her coworker faced similar consequences. His divorce had already been expensive, and losing his sales director position meant he couldn't maintain the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to. The affair that had seemed exciting and romantic when it was secret became a professional and financial disaster once it was exposed. Almost a year after discovering the affair, I'm still not sure whether Vanessa's TikTok marriage challenge explanation was real or just a desperate excuse. I've never found any evidence of such challenges on social media, but I also don't spend time looking for relationship advice on TikTok. The truth is, it doesn't really matter whether the challenge was real or not. Even if Vanessa had genuinely believed she was following some social media trend, the fact remains that she chose to have an affair instead of communicating with me about her concerns about our marriage. She chose to lie to me for months instead of working together to address our problems. She chose to risk our marriage, her career, and her reputation for a relationship with a coworker that ultimately destroyed both their professional lives. The experience taught me that some people will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid taking responsibility for their choices. Vanessa's marriage challenge excuse was just another way of blaming me for her decision to cheat. If I'd been a better husband, she wouldn't have needed to test our marriage with an affair. But I know now that our marriage problems weren't because I failed some test or didn't fight hard enough for our relationship. They were because Vanessa chose to address her dissatisfaction by pursuing someone else instead of working with me to improve our partnership. That choice says everything about her character and nothing about my worthiness as a husband. I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong in a relationship, rather than making excuses for concerning behavior. Most importantly, I've learned that real love doesn't require tests or challenges to prove its validity. People who are committed to their relationships work together to solve problems, rather than creating new problems to see how their partner will react. Vanessa's affair wasn't a test of our marriage, it was the end of it.